All right, everybody, we're going to talk real quick about what happens after World War One in the United States. We had kind of left off talking about, the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles, those kind of things, which we're going to finish covering in class on Wednesday. And as for Thursday here before test, I want to talk real quick about a couple of things that happened in the U.S. just post World War One. And first thing is U.S. isolation. We know that the United States does not sign in the League, join the League of Nations. They do not sign the Treaty of Versailles. And the whole big thing they want to do is they want to stay isolated. That means they want to keep out of European wars, because all U.S. soldiers went over there. They endured the shell shock, those kind of things, and they really just want to stay isolated in terms of what's going on. Now, this idea of isolation, where we don't get involved in anything, is going to be the U.S. policy for like the next 20 years, up until World War II happens in 1941. During the war there, the United States policy is basically we're going to try and stay out of wars. In fact, the United States actually makes their own treaties with Germany, Austria, Hungary, so we stay at League of Nations and those kind of things. So obviously the war is done now. We have thousands of U.S. soldiers returning home. Now, remember, all these factories during World War One decided to make military stuff. The whole War Industries Board, they organized it so that they made military stuff versus regular consumer products. And after a war, you always have this little recession. Recession is when the economy is bad. And basically, with the war ending and wartime demand going down, factories need to do something called retooling. So the factories will basically stop production for a while, change all their machinery from making war stuff to making non-war stuff. And during that time, there's no jobs, there's no buying, no selling, that kind of stuff. So there's a little dip in the economy right after World War One. So we have this little short recession when the economy is bad. And after the recession, things really pick up. And we're talking about how the 1920s is going to be this time of prosperity post World War One, kind of ride that woohoo, we want a war kind of feeling, and we're going to kind of coast through that 1920s, and we'll see what kind of impact that has going into our Great Depression later on. One of the issues we do have here is that you have intolerance and prejudice. Now, obviously, intolerance is not arguing other people, not being able to accept other people, those kind of things. But one thing we did have was the idea of the Great Migration. Here's this little map of it here, okay? And you can see where overland people left, where African Americans left the South and went up to different places, talking anywhere from Virginia up here to New Haven to Connecticut, Philadelphia, Baltimore, up here to say cities like Chicago and Toledo and Detroit, the big industrial centers, those kind of things. Even up here, as far as one line goes all the way up here to Milwaukee and Chicago, and to find the manufacturing jobs. Now, what the problem is that after the war, all these veterans come home and find that the jobs have been given to African Americans, and it causes some animosity between different people, different groups. And so we kind of start seeing some kind of issues that happen after this. And so there's some violence and prejudice towards African Americans after the war. We also see some segregation in cities like Chicago, even Milwaukee. There start being certain areas that are considered African American areas of the cities. And so it's almost kind of, even though there's no actual formal Jim Crow laws of segregation in the North, we start seeing segregation happening in different parts in the cities because of that. And a good example is the Chicago race riot of 1919. Basically, look at this race riot that happened. There was a fight at a beach. Basically, there was an African American kid who drifted over into the white part of the beach. It was supposed to be the white section only, and people actually started throwing rocks and those kind of things. The kid drowned, and which is really, really bad. So then a fight happens when nobody helps this kid. And so then that kind of explodes then into basically a race riot in Chicago. It leaves a lot of people dead or wounded. There's a little, that kind of trouble with segregation. There's at Chicago, they call it the Black Belt in Chicago. It's basically a certain group of neighborhoods where African Americans lived. And this riot left, almost 40 people dead, over 500 people injured because of the race relations with this new population that comes into Chicago at this time. To do those manufacturing jobs during the war. How about women? Obviously, that women took a lot of manufacturing jobs. You see them right here, during World War One. And when the guys came home from World War One, they went back to their jobs. Probably a lot of women thought it wasn't fair. They said, "Hey, we've been doing this job for a long time. We did this job very, very well. Why does this job go back to a guy just because they're guys?" And unfortunately, just the way the times was that was the case. But one of the things we see in terms of the suffrage movement is that with all the protests that happened during World War One, like Alice Paul, those kind of people we talked about, went a long way to passing the 19th Amendment. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed where women are granted the right to vote. Should have been a long time before that, but it finally happens in 1920. And women do still work. We see different things like secretarial jobs, that kind of stuff, become more acceptable for women. But in 1920, we do have the idea of suffrage starting. And so the first election where women can actually vote is going to be 1920, 1921, where the first election for women's vote actually does take place. Another thing we have here is something called the Red Scare. And obviously there's no M&Ms in this, but it's kind of a funny picture. There was a lot of public reaction to the Bolshevik or the Communist Revolution in Russia, where this group, the Bolsheviks, this group of people, took over Russia and changed the government to a very, very drastic change of government there. And there are a small group of anarchists from the Socialist Party, people that wanted to change the government here, that thought revolution would take place in the United States as well. You see, one of the things in the communist government was that it was supposed to be workers of the world unite, a worldwide revolution for the workers to get rights from the government. Well, there's a big fear that happening here. And as immigrants came from Russia and Eastern Europe, they started talking about things that are happening there. And Americans started getting afraid of immigrants from those places. They saw red. Red was the color associated with communists. It was the color of the flag used for the Bolshevik Party. And so people started getting really, really scared about this whole thing happening in the United States. And so it's kind of a big freakout that happens about anarchists and socialists and communists taking over the U.S. The question is, why were citizens scared? Well, one thing happened is right after the Bolshevik Revolution happened. It was very, very public, very, very popular. And then, considering where you have a small group of people, a very, very small political party, overthrow one of the most powerful, long-lasting empires in the world. People here in the United States think, hey, it could happen here too. And right when this goes down in 1919, there was an anarchist attack. People wanted to overthrow the government. Small group of people, they sent out letter bombs to public officials. So everyone from the White House to Secretary of State, so on and so forth. And most of these bombs didn't work or were stopped. But 2 bombs slipped through and did explode. Only anybody got killed or injured. But a few of these letter bombs, slipped through here, and basically, kind of, people started worrying that this was a revolution that was taking place, and that there's going to be some kind of communist or socialist revolution in the United States, even though these attacks were not related to anything used in Russia whatsoever. So leads to something called the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids was a government response to the Red Scare. The Attorney General was a guy by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer, and he wanted to try and get back at these, immigrants he felt that were trying to take everything over. You kind of see a little cartoon down here, come unto me, ye oppressed. Here's this European anarchist with a bomb and the knife in his hand, kind of creeping up on Lady Liberty down here. And people thought that, immigrants were dangerous because they brought these ideas. And so Palmer, along with J. Edgar Hoover, who was kind of one of the leaders of our early version of the FBI, they swept through the cities, the big cities, and arrested almost 5,000 people. Anybody who thought had a socialist tie, anybody that at some point had attended a socialist meeting or had socialist friends, those kind of things, arrested anybody they thought was a socialist or an anarchist, or honestly, a lot of times they were just immigrants. And a lot of times these people were arrested without warrants. There was actually no legal basis for the arrest. They were just arrested because they had the wrong name, the wrong friends, or the wrong place, the wrong time. About half of them were kept in custody. A lot of people were deported. Even Emma Goldman, who was we talked with her. She was the one document we read about the Homestead strike. She was a very famous socialist who wanted to see change. She was deported as well. And by the year 1920, most people figured out the attacks were a few random people doing this, not a big revolution movement, but still, kind of that fear was set in the United States about communism, those kind of things, and hurting the ideals of the U.S. And we see a big example of that in the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were 2 Italian-born guys. They were anarchists. They didn't believe in government. They thought the U.S. government was wrong. But they were living in Massachusetts, and they were working at a shoe factory they worked at, actually. And what happened was they were getting really scared about this whole idea of the Palmer. So they actually went out and they bought a gun each to stay safe. They thought, okay, if somebody comes try to beat me up or arrest me, whatever, I need a gun to make sure I protect myself. But later on, these 2 guys, what happened was the factory they worked at in South Braintree, Massachusetts, was robbed. And one of the guys, as they were trying to, as one of the people that, as this robbery took place, they stole a cash box. The guy who worked in the cash box was shot. Well, 2 weeks later, they decided to arrest Sacco and Vanzetti, and they say that these 2 guys committed the murder. And so they did. So they arrested for robbery and murder. They were charged. They were found guilty at the trial. Now, there's a lot of question about this because there wasn't a lot of evidence in the trial. Basically, it was based off of, They saw the guy looked like they thought this guy looked like Ben Seti. They thought he wore the same kind of hat, that kind of stuff. Later on, they did forensics tests on the gun, and they figured out that it was in fact Sacco's gun that shot the guy, that killed a man. But the question was, did he pull the trigger? The guy said, Sacco said that he had lost his gun or it got stolen. Those kind of questions came up. Why is the trial important? Well, a lot of people didn't think these guys were guilty. They were being held for their political beliefs rather than a crime. And so even came up with a judge who came out and said, "Oh, they're just anarchists and blah 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 blah," and he's on record saying those kind of things. So people were worried that anybody who's an immigrant, obviously still a lot of immigrants in the country at this time, and your political beliefs get you arrested, which is people said was not supposed to be something that happens in the U.S. So the question is, were they targeted for their immigrants beliefs, or are they truly targeted because they did something wrong? There was basically a worldwide protest and petition for their freedom after they were convicted. So you kind of see the signs down here. People wrote songs about them. But in the end, these two guys were still executed by electric chair in 1927. Here's the electric chair they used up in Massachusetts. And so you kind of see these big questions about things that are happening post World War I. So three big things we're looking at here real quick about what happens after the U.S. after World War I. One, isolation policy. Our new goal, stay out of foreign conflict, at least for the next couple of years until World War II takes place. The Red Scare, fear of immigrants, fear of communism, fear of anarchy, those kind of things, big fears in the United States. We're going to see how that impacts immigration later on in the 1920s. Lastly, the Great Migration and racial issues. We're talking about the 1920s, how groups of the KKK and those kind of deals make life miserable for African Americans, even though we see a lot of African American movements like the Harlem Renaissance, those kind of things come up in the same time. And it'll be a big part of what happens in the 1920s. Thanks for listening, guys. Please make sure you guys study. Some questions from this will be on your test on Monday, on Friday. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it.